and welcome to the network's Friday Forum, Restorative Justice 101. This is the third week in a series of forums that we're hosting weekly on Fridays, or in today's case on Thursday, in observance of Juneteenth, through next week. So this series includes 3 more amazing panels, including one later today at 1 p.m. on wage equity in supportive housing and the human services sector. So please join us for that conversation. The link is going to be in the chat to register. I would like to thank our sponsors and nonprofit partners who generously supported the series. And please check out our exhibitor gallery, which we also have the link in the chat. Everything you need is in the chat. Please join us next Friday, which is our last week of the forum, for a panel on equity transformations in nonprofits, Walking the Talk at 10 a.m., and a panel on re-entry supportive housing with guests from Los Angeles at 1 p.m. Links to register, again, you know where they are, they're in the chat. So on to today's program. Over the past year, we have been thinking about how to engage with each other in new ways as a community, and also about how to limit our relationship with punitive systems of justice. This led us at the network to really want to know more about the concept and the practice of restorative justice. Very luckily, we found Anooj Bhandari at the Restorative Justice Initiative, and Anooj has invited 3 incredible speakers to join us for today's workshop. So I'm going to pass it over to them to kick us off.
Cool. Good morning, everybody. My name is Anooj, as just introduced. I use they, them pronouns. He, him is fine as well. And I'm the network organizer or network coordinator at Restorative Justice Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with RJI, Restorative Justice Initiative simply works to build a citywide network of restorative practice. And that's kind of on all levels of community. So it's multi-sector. It's both in and out of institutions. It's providing spaces of communal learning around what restorative justice is, to like doing active organizing work around restorative justice within policy spaces and community spaces, and providing continued like learning and development for our community of practice. And so I'm assuming that there are probably folks on this call who have a familiarity with restorative justice and folks who don't. What I would say to get us started is that it's a little bit difficult in a 90-minute period to encapsulate all. And so we chose the layout for today really to try to get some like excitement and motivation and curiosity around the practice. And so a part of that is having 3 really phenomenal restorative justice practitioners with us. And beyond being phenomenal restorative justice practitioners, phenomenal people. And so I kind of would love to start with the 3 of you introducing yourselves, and I can also reintroduce myself with the prompt. But what I would love to kick us off with is for Umer and Vivian and Darryl, if each of you just want to take some time to introduce yourself with your names, pronouns, whatever you want to say about yourself, and then B, the question of what is a personal value that you hold that you feel like is also an essential value in your restorative justice practice? And how does that value show up in your life? So I'm going to go in the order that we're going to go later. So I'm going to toss it to you first, Umer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Umer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a social worker and restorative justice coordinator with Make the Road New York. A personal value of mine that I feel like really informs my RJ practice and that really influences my day-to-day is community and empathy. I put those 2 kind of together on the same playing field, and in the way that I think genuine community is like super dope, and I think it's very necessary when you're doing restorative justice work and just necessary in everyday life. And then empathy, because if you want to have a genuine community and a genuine like love and like friendship and everything like that, you need to have empathy for people who are going through similar and different experiences than you. And with that, I will pass it to the next person.
Cool, Vivian, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anooj and Umer. My name is Vivianne Guevara. I am the Director of Social Work and Mitigation at the Federal Public Defender of New York in Brooklyn. and I'm also a RJ facilitator in the community, and at work also. And a value, I'm still thinking of my answer because I don't know. It's different when I'm answering in different places and depending on the day and what happened on the previous day. So I think today, an essential value is if at all possible, the elimination of power. And that's while I'm in an RJ circle and as an overarching goal and value for why I facilitate RJ practices and engage in RJ practices. When in circle, you can see the elimination of power happening and the equality happening when all voices are able to be heard and all folks' input is able to be held in the circle. And so that is a value that I hold. And with that, I'll pass it to Darryl.
Thank you, Vivian. I'm Daralee Vázquez García. For those who know how to speak Spanish, Daralee. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am a community educator, RJ and TJ practitioner and learner at Connect, Safe Families, Peaceful Communities, where we engage folks in understanding the intersections of interpersonal and intimate partner violence. And we train New York City as a whole around domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And so I think Anooj mentioned my value today, and it's always been my value since I was teeny weeny. It's curiosity. I bring in curiosity because it just manifests many questions in me, and it manifests transformation when we're in circle, right? And so, and it also brings in a lot of clarity. And how do I engage in asking questions that'll deepen my understanding of folks, and also they can start working on their own curiosities and deepening their answers too. So that one, and of course, compassion, I can go with what Umer was saying, is just like we have to sometimes work with two values, and understanding that the compassion also helps me understand the complexities, the human complexities of that curiosity within circle. So, and Vivian, you mentioned, the power complexities of it too. And it's about a power with. So that's how we work. That's how I work in circle, and bring that when I'm working in my values.
Awesome. And again, I'm Anooj, they, them, he, him, and a value that I think I hold that really connects deeply to my RJ work is something between like connectivity and transcendence, like the idea that what happens between you and I on an interpersonal level, like there's a larger connection to the world because of that. And that also that like the larger world around us informs how we are able to interpersonally connect with one another. I think for me, like a lot of my RJ practice is rooted in remembering that like conflict doesn't happen out of ecosystem, and that like when things happen in community, they're connected to histories and they're connected to the community at large. And so really being able to step back from a moment and say like, what are all of the things that are merging together in this moment? And I do think that's like a general curiosity in my everyday life, is like walking down the street and seeing like smaller intimacies or smaller things, and just thinking of the liveliness of it and how it's connected to the larger world around us. So yeah, a little bit about our next like hour and 15 minutes together. So we're going to do a little bit of like a panel style exploration of restorative justice to kind of give you all like a mosaic of what it is, what it can look like on the day-to-day, which will look a little bit like me talking about kind of restorative justice on a broader level. And then Umer, Vivian, and Daralee will each kind of talk about community context of the work, specifically within education justice, the criminal legal field, and then community-based restorative justice practice, to kind of give folks just a look at like what the practice looks like on a day-to-day basis. And Finally, we're going to kind of have breakout rooms that allow you all to explore some of the questions or thoughts that come up around restorative justice. And so with that being said, I do want to ground in naming that restorative justice does transcend from indigenous tradition. The words restorative justice, I think, are probably two words that are mostly picked to name something that has been around for an extremely long time. And so with that, I also just want to acknowledge being on Lenape land, and to give a moment just to honor the traditions of Indigenous peoples and the continuation of those traditions in community. So as we're thinking of restorative justice, there's a couple ideas that came up. I know the word circle came up in a lot of the introductions. And so restorative justice is both a process and a goal of both interconnectedness and sharing community, and also how we respond to harm in community. That's really rooted in creating this larger cultural shift, right? It's this larger cultural shift from systems that are punitive, are carceral, are exclusionary, to a culture that is really rooted in being able to share space as a community in the face of harm on an everyday basis, so that a community can better hold harm together. Right? It says that instead of exclusionary practice, a moment of harm or a moment of conflict is an opportunity to invite in and to open up space to be able to deepen our relationships with one another. And so while traditional punitive and carceral practices really center this question of who did what, and really is about trying to put an action to a specific individual or a group of people, the focus of restorative justice spaces is really like, what is being experienced here, and what's the world around us that led to this moment. And so it creates a space that allows us to not only explore the nature of conflict, but also the nature of our lives on a day-to-day basis, so that in the process of holding conflict, we're also more deeply humanizing one another, right? And the word circle was said a lot in the introductions. That often happens through what are called restorative justice circles, which will be talked about in, which will be touched on, I'm sure, as we talk about what RJ can look like on a day-to-day level. And so before we get into the day-to-day, I just want to name like a few other like components of restorative justice work. And Umer and Vivian and Daralee, if you feel like I'm missing out on essential components, feel free to just add them in as you all are sharing out. So a few pieces that I wanted to name about it are that it's mostly preventative. And that really the work of building deeper relationships and building deeper community with one another sets it up so that restorative justice in the face of responding to harm can be more successful and can thrive, right? It's really a practice of saying, if we do the work of connecting with one another deeply on a day-to-day basis, then that will inherently change how we interact with one another in the face of harm and conflict. Around harm and conflict specifically, restorative justice says that peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the transformation of it, right? Restorative justice spaces don't seek to simply have it so that all of the parties say, okay, things are fine. Restorative justice really works with the before, the during, and the after, right? It strives to understand the stories that inform people before they show up in the circle. It really centers those stories while people are there. And it thinks through those stories of like, what are the points of accountability and transformation that we want to commit to after, right? And I think there's a lot of synonymizing of restorative justice with restorative justice circles, and restorative justice circles being the alternative to punitive discipline itself. But I personally like to think of the circle as the pathway to the alternative. A circle is a way for community members to convene and really to think, what are our next steps for transformation? How do we want to grow a culture of accountability together? And then another important piece of it is that I believe that this work is decarceral, decolonial, and anti-racist if done right. And I think that that takes a lot of work and practice and intention and care and love. But I think this work in its kindest and most gracious form is able to offer us a moment to return to ourselves and to each other. And in that process, really be able to manifest a different world. I think a huge factor of restorative justice is the co-creation of space. And so while traditional punitive systems often mean if something goes wrong, we call on an external body to be able to come in and respond, restorative justice is really rooted in the co-creation of how we want to treat one another together, and the idea that we all can follow that in space together. And so traditionally, a restorative justice space would start off with some kind of a community agreement. And so I want to put up some community agreements to share with you all. And I know that me like delegating and sharing out community agreements is not the same as co-creation. But I thought it was a way to do it with 100 participants in this space. But I would invite you, if there are other community agreements that you feel like you commonly use or you think are really helpful, please put them in the chat. I like to think of community agreements not only as like how we treat one another in the space, but really like how we manifest the world we want to build, right? So if we want to move towards a world where we are able to be caring in community for each other and to hold the harm that comes up, what are the behaviors we need to take on? So these are the community agreements that we have for today. And so I can read through them out loud for folks, but it's be as present and open as your context allows. Listen deeply to the self and to each other. Lean into discomfort with welcome and embrace. I think because restorative justice is such a culture shift, oftentimes in the learning process, folks leave with more questions than answers. And so to really lean into that process of question asking. And I would also say that process is essential to a community circle or a restorative justice circle. Ask for what is needed, care for yourself, remember the importance of confidentiality, expect and accept a lack of closure. And there's no obligations, all options. Empathy and patience. Words aren't always easy, and that is okay. Be curious with one another and show up with a want to learn more, and put into action what you learn and share. And so if folks have any questions around any of these or what they mean, or if you have community agreements that you would love to add to this, please feel free to do that. So I'll give a moment just for folks to contribute any in the chat if that's exciting, or you can feel free to come on speaker and name some.
I would add, Anooj, you can pass. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you have the talking piece while we're in circle that you have to speak, because there is no coercion within RJ circles. So you are welcome to pass and don't have to actually participate. You could just sit and listen throughout the whole RJ process as well.
Thanks for that, Darryl. Yeah, so in a little bit, we're gonna break into breakout rooms and we'll give a question to each of the breakout rooms. If you wanna pass, that's totally fine. Thanks for that. Anything else? Amazing. So with that being said, I would love yeah,
there's one in the chat, and there's some take space, make space. Somebody said.
Oh, awesome! Thank you. Yeah, so take space, make space. Add that for sure. Cool. So we're gonna jump in to kind of hear about like what restorative justice can look like on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of different community applications of it, and so three that I think we see kind of on a more common basis are in the education space, in the criminal legal field, and on a grassroots community level. And so Umer, Vivian, and Darryl are kind of going to each talk about the context in which they work. And so Umer, we'll start with you and then we'll pass it on from there. But feel free to let us know what is the context in which you work and what does that look like on a day-to-day basis. So I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Anooj, for that introduction. I appreciate you so much for defining restorative justice, because whenever people ask me to define restorative justice, I'm like, well, it's this thing that we, and like, I never know what to say. So I appreciate you very much for handling that part of it. So again, my name is Umer. I use he, him pronouns. I work for Make the Road New York, specifically at Bushwick High School, and I'm the restorative justice coordinator there. Before I get into a little bit about the day-to-day, I just want to talk a little bit about like how, so traditionally restorative justice is used as a response to harm, right? And in high school specifically, they talk about it a lot as an alternative for suspensions, right? So when a student gets in trouble or when they get into a fight or something, they're like, oh, we have to suspend this student. Like, this is part of the rules. This is what has to happen. And the traditional conversation around implementing restorative justice is, oh, we'll do a restorative justice circle and then we'll decide what happens afterwards. That's the very, very traditional way that it's talked about in school, right? But the day-to-day of how I try to practice it looks a little bit different, because I think the idea that harm, and I think Anooj, you touched on this a little bit, harm doesn't exist like in a vacuum, right? Like harm exists in the context of other things existing, right? And so when something bad does happen, or when a fight does happen, right? It's like, what led up to that? What's impacting that? And then how do we address everything that happened beforehand, everything that happened like during the fight and all the harm that was caused there, and then everything that's going to happen afterwards. Because it's never a linear process, you know, like it's a circle. It just keeps on going and going, and hopefully the idea is to like create a new circle and step into that new circle, and one that kind of addresses the harm. And a lot of that I think is important to understand before like talking about what the day-to-day looks like. And so a lot of my work exists in the context of community building and like building capacity amongst young people and students. My hope and my goal when I do RJ with my students and like the teachers I work with is to put myself out of a job eventually, right? Like I don't want to run circles forever. I love it. I'll do it, right? Like they don't have to like twist my arm or anything. Like I'll do it whenever they want me to do it. But like I want students leading the process, and I want like staff leading I want them co-leading the process in general. Like that's my goal and my ambition with them. And with the pandemic and everything going virtual, like a lot of students are learning from home. And then the question there is, how do we engage young people in meaningful conversations and in restorative justice virtually when they struggle engaging in their communities and in their schools? And one of my students told me, he's like, Mr. Why would I go to class when outside is open? He's like, outside is open, but inside, I'm stuck doing work all day. So like, what's the point? I'll just do my work at the end of the school year and I'll pass. And I was like, you know, I'm not gonna argue with you. That's a fantastic point. Like, by all means, go outside. And the conversation came up of like, how do we engage young people in building this leadership capacity and everybody is virtual at the same time. So a very specific example of see how this is applied is for the past 6 months, I've been running this restorative justice internship with like a group of students and staff. And it's 15 students and 10 staff, right? And the hope and the goal in that was to build community and capacity so that when we return back into the school building, students knew each other, students were connected with each other and with staff, and that when a conflict does happen or when something does happen, students can work to de-escalate it on their own with like my guidance and staff guidance and things like that. That was the original goal. And my idea was like every week I'd panic. I'd be like, oh, what am I doing? What are we supposed to do? How do I do this virtually? I don't even know anybody here. And like every week I'd be in a panic. And as time, like trusting the process. I think that's always the big thing for me in restorative justice. Like if you trust the process will create itself and evolve into what it's supposed to be. And it started out very awkward, right? And very complicated. And I had no idea what I was doing. And it's evolved into something very beautiful and like very connected amongst the students and the staff. And I think one thing, so I was thinking about how to like talk about my day-to-day work. And recently we just had our last meeting of the year with all the interns, the teachers, and the staff. And I had students reflect and talk about like what restorative justice means to them, how they feel like they can apply it, and things that they've learned from the internship. So I decided I'm gonna like talk more about the day-to-day and how restorative justice can look like in school and how it does look like in schools, kind of through their eyes for the most part. One of my students said that when he started the internship, he had no idea what it was. And every week he was like, why am I here? What is this? Right? Like, this makes no sense to me. And by the end of it, he said that he felt very connected to the school community as a freshman who had never entered the building and who had known nobody coming into the building. So he had been virtual for the better part of his like 8th grade year and then joined a new high school and didn't know anybody. And he felt very connected in that process afterwards. Another one of my students said that I didn't know we'd spend a whole meeting talking about cheese and cows, because we did that once and I don't remember the context of why, but like we did it. And I learned a lot in that meeting. Like I learned about goat cheese, which is still like really weird to me, but like some people are really passionate about it. I was like, what? Like, what is this? The third quote that I think was really interesting is one of the freshmen who I think is like a superstar. Her name is Salma. I quote her all the time. She's like, if she wants, she could have my job tomorrow. Like she is a star. She's phenomenal, right? And she was like, when this was pitched to us, we were talking about doing responses to harm and de-escalation, like amongst each other. But one of the things that came out of it is we talked about community harm and like community context. And we had like a lot of conversations around how COVID has affected us and our families, right? What are the supports that we need and how we can support each other? And one of the big topics that everybody really jumped in on was the highlighting of mental health during the pandemic, which I wish the pandemic didn't need to happen for us to like really focus and jump in on mental health, especially in schools. But now that it's happening, I'm like, yes, I'm all about this. Let's do this. And the students decided to have like a mental health workshop, student led and like organized, and have like circles and conversations around like what is mental health? How does your mental health affect you? Right? Like how can you identify signs of like a mental health crisis? Like this was all student generated for the most part. And the best way I can think of like contextualizing what I've learned from this experience working at a high school and what I will hopefully continue to do is that interpersonal harm and addressing interpersonal harm is very important, especially when you're working in a high school, because it's like you see the same people every day, right? And you got to build the community, build it so that when something does happen, it's addressed immediately. And the hope is to prevent those things from happening in the first place. But there's also community harm that's going on a daily basis, especially in the communities of color, like Hispanic, Black and Brown communities, right? Like there's generations of harm that has occurred, and then there is harm that is continuing to grow, build, and inequities. And like all those things are happening concurrently with students expecting to pass geometry, right? Like an isosceles triangle, I'm sure is very important, but whether or not you have food for dinner is probably much more important than knowing what an isosceles. I don't even know what an isosceles triangle is. I just learned about it yesterday. It's amazing. And addressing those within the context of education and addressing those concurrently with the context of the school is very important. Restorative justice gives us space to do that. And I guess I'll close with highlighting, Anooj, you said something about the co-creation of space in your introduction to restorative justice. And I just want to like really highlight that like as much as possible, especially in the context of education, right? Like we as adults in education are often put in the role of teacher, right? And educator and leader. And in the goal and the hope for like doing restorative justice is to kind of like chip away at that and not be teacher, not be educator, not even be facilitator, right, in a circle, but to be participant and to step on the same level and for all of us to like step in that space and go from there and build and be like, hey, this is what our community needs here in this building, and this is what our community needs there outside of this building. Let's build on this together, and let's use your voices as student leaders to kind of like step into those spaces and advocate for you and to like build capacity in those spaces. And I can talk about this for like 45 minutes, and I know I will, so I will stop and I will pass it back to Anooj or to Vivian. I'm not sure which way to go.
Yeah, we can pass it to Vivian. And if questions are coming up for folks, I encourage you to write them down in the chat. Feel free to do so. And as our speakers continue to talk, we can pick up on some of the questions that are coming up as well. So Vivian, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Umer. Also, so I'm a social worker at the Federal Public Defender in Brooklyn, and we represent folks who are charged with federal crimes in Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, and Staten Island. And so RJ and my work, it started in around 2014 when I was looking for something to help with sentencing for a client of mine. And that was my first RJ circle. I learned a lot doing it because I feel like I did all the wrong things. And I did all the wrong things with the lawyer and looking at RJ as, oh, this is for sentencing. Oh, this is a means to an end. Oh, this is going to look great. He's going to apologize and everything's going to look great for him on paper. But sitting in that circle, and that was my first experience with RJ, was in an RJ circle, facilitating one, realized that it was a process that really brought healing to my client and his family more than anything. And so that ended up being what happened in that circle. There wasn't really an apology, but at that point really became unnecessary. And so now the context where in my work, how I use RJ in a public defender context is really to validate my client's experience, really to not look at the process as a binary process of like someone did something bad, someone did something, is the risk, is the person that got harmed, but really to recognize everybody who's sitting in whatever circle that I'm facilitating as all being survivors of some kind of harm, having experienced some kind of harm, and especially my clients who have experienced institutional harm from the criminal legal system, as well as all of the other things that came before I met them. So it really isn't, I know a lot of times when people think of RJ in the criminal legal context, it is that meeting of somebody did something wrong to another person or to another institution. And so it's the meeting of these two parties, and the goal of that meeting is for someone to repair some harm that they caused to another person or to another institution. But when I sit down in the circle in the criminal legal context, it really is, we are here to build community. We are brought together by an event, and somebody was harmed through this event, but moving forward, we are all responsible for each other. We are all responsible for making sure that we're all taken care of, and figuring out how to pass that on to our community members going forward. So since that first circle, that is how I engage folks who ask for that process, including the survivors or victims who ask for that process. I'm very clear about this is what the process looks like to me, is a meeting of folks who are from the same community, meaning the world to me. So we are all coming together to discuss what happened and also ways to move forward. Day to day, RJ, I don't do that many RJ processes in my social work public defender capacity. Probably about since 2014, probably about 2 a year. But how it looks day to day is that since 2014, I'm constantly talking about it in my office and constantly also trying to bring those values to my fellow public defenders, because there are still public defenders who do look at clients as, you're the one that did something wrong. You're the one that needs to do everything to make this right. What are you going to do? And so really bringing the values of RJ of like, yes, they are here. We are representing folks because they are charged with a crime. But here is another way to look at it. that they have also been survivors. They have also been impacted by institutional racism, by poverty, by all of these different systems, and now they're here. So look at it that way, and then you see it as a more like global problem and not the problem of this one person doing this one thing. And so that's how it looks day to day. It's just really trying to instill values, RJ values, within the way that people think about other people and the way that they think about harm, the way that they think about repairing harm, the way that they think about laws, even of the laws that exist. I know that folks want to enter court and enter their profession as lawyers or even public defenders, social workers, as honoring the laws or respecting laws. And while I don't walk in and say disrespect all the laws, I really want people to question the laws and question who made them, why they were made, why they're still there, and to look at all the laws that have been changed over time because people have recognized they're unfair or they're racist or sexist or homophobic laws. And so looking at the law like that as the ability to be changed and honor people and not honor whatever was happening 200 plus years ago. With that, I'll pass it to Darryl.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. Ooh, I have so much to say. Just processing everything. So at Connect, we engage in circles. We've been doing circles for a very long time, and which is very much restorative. However, we make it clear that when we're in circle, as I mentioned before, and something that Umer is trying to work with as well, is understanding that in circles, there is no hierarchy, right? And when there is no hierarchy in circles, we're sharing that power with. Now, what does that look like in our everyday circles, especially if we are trying to provide space and agency to survivors or victims of domestic violence, is understanding that circles are preventative work, but within that prevention, there is intervention, and within that intervention, we're all coming along in moments of collective healing. It's very trauma informed. Okay, so when there is healing, there is transformation, but we have to be very clear that this survivor and the one who has caused harm is not only coming in with that specific story. There's many stories, right, that come in, many layers that come in with them. So we have to be understanding that when we're in circle, that specific story or harm that happened at that moment will show up, but many others, such as systemic violence, right? Societal trauma, all of that is going to show up during our circles. So we're very aware of that, and which sort of like dictates, right, where our circle will go or where it will not go. So which is why we constantly provide space for these for the circles. And something that I've learned recently, and we say this very many times, right? It's just that the reason why we place so much agency in victims and survivors is because they don't want the state to be included. They don't want to call the police on the person who has caused them harm. So we listen to those stories. We listen to why. Especially if you're from a Black community, where calling the police can make things even worse, you know, for the Black families. Children are taken away from their families once DV is mentioned. If you're a Black immigrant, that makes it worse. So there's so much that happens within that call to systems that we want to avoid that. And that is why we center the agency on the survivor and also the harmer, and understanding that there is going to be transformation for everyone in the community. So it's collective healing. and that's where we do a lot of the work. And not only do we do these RJ circles and understanding that there's conflict and all that, but we also have community building circles at Connect. We also have affinity groups. We have circle dialogues solely for men, for men to understand what is manhood, what is masculinity. We have wisdom circles within women, for women's circles. We have healing circles solely for survivors, placing the agency on them. So, and how do we come up with this? It was a lot of grassroots organizing. So we were out there, Connect, a lot of the staff was out there asking questions. There was a survey put out, and when the educators got together and started looking at these surveys, they were like, oh, so the problem here in the intersections of either gun violence or any other type of violence has a lot to do with intimate partner violence. So how do we bring in circles in our communities that will infuse all of these in with a healing process, but also get to the root of the problem, which is white supremacy and patriarchy, right? And how do we work together in that prevention? So that's all. That's all that we come into these circles. And so we also have to understand that I know that, but a lot of our survivors or harmers, or those who have caused harm, don't know that. So we have to meet them where they're at. And that's where the processes of the circles starts bringing in the curiosity and the transformation, not only for myself, but also for the community and the people who are centered in the circle. So that's as much as I have, and it's just like we have all these different types of circles that are talking, understanding, there's healing, there's, like Vivian was mentioning, sentencing, there's support. If you know of, let's say, a couple, like a group of a couple of teens, there's teen dating violence, and the breakup is very harmful for both of them, especially the one who's being hurt. You can do a circle for that. You can do a circle and say, hey, we could help with the grieving of the breakup, and also understand that it's not going to work. So it's just, and it creates more of an understanding, like they're being seen and heard within that relationship with other folks. So reintegration, celebration, and a sharing of wisdom as well. So it's how we work at Connect. So if anyone has any questions?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that I know all of us have thoughts on, but would it be possible to touch briefly on how restorative justice differs from transformative justice?
Oh, I can do that. So restorative justice, as Anooj had mentioned before, comes from indigenous practices, right? And there is a understanding that is to repair harm. It's being used in institutions. It's being used in schools. There is conflict. Is understanding that conflict can be generative, right? And understanding that there is harm to be spoken about, and to repair all that. Not to say that there are RJ practitioners that don't get into the root of the harm and where that's coming from. However, transformative justice does not include any type of institution. And they're understanding that the root of the problem can be the lack of resources, access to these resources. And so how do we provide these resources to these communities within the transformative justice circle? And I just want to make it clear that transformative justice circles was created by and historically speaking from the historical impact of Stonewall, where they didn't want police included. So the TJ started coming up a little bit more and understanding that it is outside of the state. And community-based. Okay, so that's the difference between RJ and TJ, is understanding that there is transformation within transformative justice, but also the change of policies, the change of community access to resources in the community, and not including institutions. And it's also very trauma and healing informed.
Yeah, another way that I've always thought about transformative justice is that like we experience harm between us because of systems that we don't always see at play on a day-to-day basis. But to reduce the power of those systems or the interaction between people in those systems is to change the way that you and I are able to relate to one another on a day-to-day basis. So understanding that there's this deeper connection between systems around us and how we are able to relate to each other. Amazing. And what I would love to do before we kind of break into like conversational circles is just pass it back again to Umer and Vivian and Darryl. And what I would love for each of you to offer to the space is a question that you're asking right now about your relationship to this work, right? I think this work really fuels itself off of communal curiosity. And so kind of building that tool here. What is a question that you're asking yourself about this work right now? And I don't know if we have to do it in order, but whoever feels ready to answer it of the three of you, feel free to just jump in.
I can go. The question that I'm usually asking myself is, so I do practice transformative justice processes outside of my job, and then I practice restorative justice processes at my job, and sometimes for other systems that ask me to facilitate processes for a court system or for another type of system. And the question that I ask myself a lot is, am I co-opting RJ by practicing RJ within systems? And so because I'm facilitating a process that a prosecutor has to approve, or that a judge needs to know about, or that somebody has said, I will do this in exchange for this. How do I feel about that co-optation? How do I feel about that being, about RJ kind of being like an agreement before it happens? Or I guess it feels a little coercive to me sometimes. And so that's the question I ask myself, is that responsible? Am I being responsible? How can I make this so that it's not, so that it feels natural and whole and holistic to the people that are going to be there, and doesn't feel like it's something that's forced. And Anooj, how do you maintain the consent or choice of the practice when it's mandated? Yeah, and so I feel like even the processes that I've done, like they're not mandated, but there still is this thing of like, there's somebody overseeing it, and there's somebody who has to say okay to it. And so I don't know, those are the questions that come up for me. Is that okay? Or is it not? I'll pass it.
It's okay. I got this. Thank you. Ladies first. Anyway, so I think something that I come in with and I question all the time is within circles is, do I have the capacity to do this today as a circle keeper? Right? Because I live vicariously, this trauma, I have vicarious trauma. And do I have the capacity to work with my community today, understanding that I need to maybe sometimes sit back and do that self-care and caring for my traumas, my personal traumas and the community trauma, right? And I always think about that. And also, where is my positionality in this too, as a gatekeeper, as a Latina that is white, so I have to also understand that positionality puts me in a place where I have to just like maybe understand a little bit more of how I can not overpower in circles and just sit back. So I'm always asking that when I'm in circle and when I'm going to start building or preparing for that circle in the safety planning also for the survivor or the victim in the case. So, I don't know if that makes sense. So there's a lot of questions that I ask myself, and do I have the right analysis too when it comes to power and race when I'm in circle too, so this is something that I have been working for the past 15 years. And every day I come in asking myself these questions when I'm in circle. So it's this very, it's my responsibility. So, because I just don't want to cause more harm than what Black communities have gone through and Brown communities as communities as well. So it's always like creating the questions that will deepen in our curiosity, but also wanting to have everyone leave in a place of healing. So that's the questions that I come in with most of the time. That transparency is hard, right? But we got, it's really honest.
Yeah, I mean, I so appreciate all of the things that are being shared. I mean, even in like the larger connection of the three of your work, like I think we went from really thinking about like, how do we envision a community that can both do like what it's named as intended to do, but also like heal each other and bring each other closer together and take care of our needs. And then moving to Vivianne's, like, how does that open up more ways to understand one another than just like the binary of good and bad? And I also just want to name that binary transcends from criminal legal definitions of good and bad. And it also makes conflict seem like something that is only a specific incident, right? Like, I think criminal legal definitions of conflict impact how we understand conflict to happen on an everyday basis as a specific incident or a violent incident, rather than something that we all are holding in perpetuity, right? And so it's really normalizing that idea of like, well, we all are holding conflict within us, around us, with other people, with systems, with nature. And then really going to what Daralee was talking about, that like, well, if we have that understanding, then this question of what do you need to heal, it applies across the board, right? And so we would kind of love to transition into a moment of breakout rooms with our next half an hour together. But kind of how this is going to work is we'll pose a question. We will send everybody into breakout rooms of 5 or 6 people for about 10 minutes, just to really dive into the question a little bit. And then we'll invite people back, have a little bit of group communal reflection around what that question was like, and then we'll move into another question. So we'll just do a few rounds of that. And so for the first question, it's simply, what can restorative justice look like in the context of supportive housing, right? And we understand that there are folks on this call who are working in multiple aspects of supportive housing. And so this can be as dreamy and abstract of a brainstorm, or as a specific of a brainstorm as you would like it to be. I don't think we have a specific parameter around that. I'd love to hear from a couple folks from their small groups. Like, what are some of the things that came up, or what are some of the things that you all talked about? If we could have a couple people share out, that'd be awesome. And you can also feel free to use the chat.
Well, in my group, we talked about a couple different things. We talked about potentially using restorative justice practices in place of calling 911 or the NYPD when there are conflicts between residents. And then we also talked about using the circle or other RJ practices as kind of the more like healing and I guess like community building tool. And with that, we thought also about involving the neighbors to the program and not just limiting it to the specific supported housing program, but involving the neighborhood as well, so that there could be a little bit more integration between the residents and their neighbors.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Something I love from my group was we talked about how a lot of folks may already be doing restorative justice, but didn't have language for it. So that this really helped kind of contextualize it and then think about how to build on what's already happening.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, the main function I think of when I hear of the words restorative justice themselves itself is like to be able to kind of build that solidarity around the work and like have a place to like root how we're able to really do this as a collective. And with that notion of collective, I love that it was brought up, like how do we work this into a neighborhood at large? How do we build connections between people that systems don't traditionally or necessarily bring together on a day-to-day basis? Any other reflections that people want to share out?
Our group talked about a situation that unfortunately occurs where people are doubled up and become roommates and are at different stages in their recovery, which is challenging. One of our members had the notion of using restorative justice to create a kind of community between the participants, and realizing that they can be a source of strength to each other as opposed to a source of irritation, that they're on the same sort of path, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, and I just want to uplift, April is also noting in the chat around like interpersonal goings on between residents. Awesome. And we ask these questions not to say that they have to be explored in these 10 minutes, but we hope that they are brought outside of this space. We hope that they are able to continue elsewhere, and that these smaller conversations can kind of be a spark of the larger ones. And so we're going to break out into another round of rooms. And this time we're going to talk about what challenges or tensions come up for you when you think about restorative justice. So if you were to think, okay, let's lean into this practice, what are the questions or challenges that come to your mind? So we're going to take another 10 minutes to think about that, and we'll come back at around 8:22 thing. Welcome back again, everybody. So, oh, I think there are still a few people. Okay, so just like the last round, we would love to hear a few folks share out what are some of the challenges and tensions that that came up in the conversation.
One thing that we were discussing was that a lot of us are sort of forced into working within the system, and a lot of us, we already have these protocols that are set in place that we can't really go against when considering how to address different incidents or whatnot. So that's one of the biggest challenges, at least like for the people in our group, to address, how can we work with our communities to make sure that there isn't more harm being caused, but at the same time, how do we make sure that we aren't going against what, the people that are paying our salaries and paying, for the housing that we are supplying for people are outlining for us. I think it's a really fine line for a lot of us to toe. And we brought up like the implementation and discussion around values and making that a really big thing in our workplaces, and sort of trying to shift the culture in the way that we are talking about the populations in our communities that we're working with and working in, both inside and outside of work, because obviously the way that we act outside of work and the way that we talk about work outside of work affects how we are acting when we are at our office, and that affects how we are when we're working with our communities. Because I think a lot of us, like, our protocols say if there's any incident or if there's any sort of imminent danger, you have to call the cops, and that's not something that people who are working in case management roles can really change. That's something that comes from something that's way above our head. But we can have these discussions surrounding, how can we better create the sense of unity in our community, and how can we, better serve the people that are coming in our doors and address the harms that are being committed in our communities. But I think it just goes towards how can we be working from within the system and trying to just move our way out of that.
And also we talked about how we should take a holistic approach. Like you can't fix part of something, you have to make it whole before it could actually be restored. And that takes collaboration from different government agencies. Like a person might need a psychologist, or they might need a therapist, or they might need a doctor, or they might need a social worker. All these things play a part in making them whole. You need to look at that also.
Yeah, which goes into this larger question to me about like, well, how are communities resourced and how, like, I know I don't think any of us who are organizing around restorative justice organize for like restorative justice circles alone, right? It's like all of the practices and resources that have historically been stripped from communities. It's really advocating for all of those too.
I'll just add in support of what Anne was saying. I'm coming from a street outreach perspective, so not necessarily at the supportive housing point, but working with our clients who are going from the street into perhaps like a transitional placement. Really, RJ is used in the whole process, thinking about the person, similar to what Anne was saying, what placement makes the most sense, how much support do they need, and really making sure that that placement makes sense so that they can be successful and move on to supportive and permanent housing. So from our perspective, it's just kind of embedded in our process, and it's really important to making sure that our clients are successful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any other folks who want to share out around tensions or challenges or the conversations that came up?
We also talked a little bit about the power structures that sort of exist naturally in like the human services field, and how that can obviously cause friction between people that are working together and working with our communities and whatnot, and how it's important to, or how it should be important, and we can work towards sort of rejecting those power structures in a sense, and trying to work towards being more recognition that we're not that far from being on the other side of the table from the people that we're working with. And it doesn't have to be a relationship, like it doesn't necessarily have to be a very strict, like I'm a case manager and you're my client relationship. And I'm a very big proponent of rejecting professionalization in nonprofits, because I think that it can cause a lot of harm when people see it as a very structured and transactional relationship. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think like I know myself and Umer and Darryl and Vivian, we all have like grassroots components of our practice that sit out of institutions and also are navigating a lot of these power dynamics on a day-to-day basis as well. I think one of the things that comes up for me is just like really rooting this work in a preventative community practice, and rather starting at what seems to be the toughest place of a power dynamic, really start through a process of like really like building people power and building the conversational power, you know, and really starting with normalizing the conversations around like, well, why is this important, right? Like why is it important for all of us? I know that we're at our 90 minutes. So I just want to put out a huge shout out to Umer and to Vivian and to Daralee. Thank you all so much for sharing yourselves and sharing your practices. And I know I always like learn so much just from being around you all, which I think is another thing about this work, is just like the growth comes through sharing space. And so the more we convene, the more I feel like we are able to build kind of that power in this practice together. So thank you all. I'm sorry because of time we didn't get to have like a communal like closing reflection. But I think the question I would love to extend to you all as we leave this space is really like, what do you dream for the communities that you are in, right? What do you dream for the communities that you're a part of? And so I hope that that's a question that we can leave with and we can really like harness to transform the work we're doing.
Thank you.
Or, I'm sorry, or we could just place a cute icon of how you're feeling.
That's great as well.
Emoji, come on, bring up those hearts.
Oh, right, reaction.
Go to your reaction.
What are your reactions?
Yay.
Thanks for that, Darryl. That's great.
Thank you. I also just want a huge thank you to Anooj. I also thank you to the speakers, but huge thank you to Anooj. Put this all together. We had an initial conversation with them and they were just so on board and ready. And we are just so grateful for you to putting this together. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. Hope to see you again soon. And I put the link.
An hour and a half.
Yes, an hour and a half. The registration, yes, really quickly, let me just put that again so it's right there for you. At 1 p.m. we have a conversation on wage equity with a great lineup. We have Fred Shack from Urban Pathways. We have Attorney General Tish James. Anyways, there's more information in that link. Check it out, and we hope that you'll register and join us. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Folks.